No matter the type of game you're making, you're going to need some user interface. Whether it just be a couple of texts overlaying giving you a score, or maybe your entire game is played through a user interface. So today, let's get started with the basic concept of how to set up UI in Unreal Engine using widget blueprints. A couple of the most important do's and don'ts, and general information that will be useful going forward in the rest of this series, where I will be taking a deeper look at individual widget components to really start dynamically building out your UI. But today, I just want everybody to be on the same page, making a piece of UI and just adding it to the screen and making it look a certain way. So first and foremost, we're going to get started here by going in and going to user interface after we right click, and then we make a widget blueprint. Pretty much everything we're going to do, we're going to make off of the widget blueprint. There's a bunch of classes here that you can make this off of. Again, most of the time what we're going to do is we're going to just make it off of the user widget. The widgets themselves kind of work in the same way as any actor or object would, meaning that you can make children of the widgets that you've already created. So you can set up a parent widget with a bunch of code on it and then override that code, or otherwise just use that code to set up certain things, like making a color a variable. You can then make a bunch of different children off of that and just set that variable to something else and it will look different. Anyway, for now, we're going to just call this something like BP or WBP for widget blueprint. Some people just do W for widget. I like WBP. And we'll just call this the HUD or something like this. This is going to be the thing that we actually add to the screen. There is an important distinction to be made with widgets, and that is widgets that you add to the screen and widgets that you add to other widgets. And that distinction more or less mostly comes down to what you're going to use to house these widgets, because these widgets need to exist within some sort of space. We can just add in a button like this if we wanted to, but now the button is the entire screen, which is not what we want. So we need to give it some space to live in, like giving it a house, right? So there's a couple of different things that you can do. You can give it a border, or we also have this thing called an overlay, which is just an empty space for a widget to exist in. If you're going to be adding a widget directly to the screen, usually that means you use a canvas panel. And the reason we use a canvas panel for things that we add to the screen is because it has very good intelligent scaling to scale across multiple different aspect ratios, different resolutions, and that kind of stuff. That also means that they're more expensive to render. So you don't want every other sub-widget that we're going to be making throughout the rest of this series to run off of a canvas panel. So any widgets that you make that you're going to be adding into this won't use a canvas panel. Those will use something more along the lines of the overlay. And I'll just actually show you. We'll make a new widget here and we'll call that sub-widget, WBP sub-widget. And that one, I will add in an overlay. And at first glance, these will seem fairly similar, right? If I go back and forth and I select this one as well, like this looks effectively the same, just slightly different zoom levels. See, it's effectively the same thing. But what if I add in an image to this overlay? The way we can do that is just typing an image. It's a pre-existing widget component that we can use. And you can either just drag it in like this, or more importantly, you can drag it into the hierarchy to have a little bit more control over what you attach this to. Because if you have like a bunch of different things already set up here, you want to be sure that you attach it to the right thing. But as you can see here, this image now is just kind of like a small little image here in the top left corner. And there's not that much that we can do about that. We can align it with this menu on the right side to something else. We can align it to the middle. We can align it to the left or the right or the bottom. Or we can make it fill the entire thing horizontally and or vertically. So that's what these things do here for the overlay slots. But we can't very easily say, I want it to like exist over here. If we want to do that, we need to set up a whole bunch of like extra stuff and weird stuff. And then it's also going to not very intelligently scale if we add this to the screen. Comparing that to adding in an image into our canvas panel over here, you'll see that it adds it in somewhat the same way, but when I click on it, I first and foremost have this little anchor thing. We'll get back to that in a moment. But now I can just place this wherever I want on the screen, just like it is a program like GIMP or Photoshop. I can very easily make it whatever size that I want it to be, and everything will be good. Now, we have these anchors instead of with the overlay where we had these alignments only. Here we have a position and a size for the anchor for this image. And that is going to give us information about where on the screen to anchor this to if we stretch this screen out, right? If this screen suddenly becomes twice as wide, what do we want to do with this image? Do we want it to like stick close to the center of the screen, at which point we'll just put this anchor to the center and it will scale proportionate to that as its pivot point. If you've ever done any like 3D art, you know the pivot point of your mesh. These anchors are kind of like that. And we can actually kind of test this out with here on the top right side. We have a couple of options for the screen size that we want to test this out on. So if I want to go onto a phone, so a bunch of presets here. I can say, well, actually, I want to see what this looks like on an iPhone 10, right? And then suddenly this is the landscape mode, clearly. And we have a couple of things for like safe zones, like don't put anything important into these red areas, because this is going to be where your like top notch is, I believe, and this bottom thing, I am not entirely sure what it is. It might be the like side of the screen or whatever. I don't really know much about iPhone stuff. But we can see this like tablets, iPad Air 2, right? Suddenly has a different aspect ratio as well. So we can see how responsive our UI is on different screen sizes. And there's a whole bunch of different presets here. Now we also have this fill screen or custom on screen, desired and desired on screen. For canvas panels, that's generally not as important, but if you go back into this widget over here, that might be a lot more relevant, because now it's set to filling screen. And you can see that the overlay here fills the entire like 16:9 screen. But if I set this just to be desired, this is one that you're going to be using a lot, desired, you see that it actually, the overlay scales just to its contents. And we can test that, because if we put this WBP sub-widgets into our HUD, which we can just do, the moment we make a widget, it becomes available to put inside of other widgets. So WBP sub-widgets, right? You can see that indeed doesn't fill the entire screen, but rather it like spawns in about this size. And now we can actually start seeing as well that indeed this thing, the image that we put in here, just aligns to the center. It doesn't grow when we make this entire area bigger or whatever. But if we set this image up to instead fill the horizontal and vertical space, you can see that now it does do that. And of course we can do this in whatever way we want. Maybe I want this to align to the right and fill vertically. So now it will do that. It will fill vertically and align itself horizontally just to the right. When making sub-widgets, usually the first thing that I do is I come up here and set it to desired or desired on screen. It's effectively the same thing, just so that you have a better look at what things actually will look like when you put them into your canvas widgets. Now, each individual widget is also going to have its own unique stuff, mostly to do with its appearance. So if we put in an image here, we can set its brush to either an image. We can give it a tint, which is just going to be a color. If we put in an image in here, it's going to tint that image to that color. So let's just put in like a temporary image that we can, like this. You can see that it's the material for the mannequin is now tinted a little bit blue, because this just applies a tint to the input image, which is actually really, really kind of useful. But we're going to keep this being white, which is no tint applying at all. For images specifically, we can draw it just as an image, but we can also draw it as a box, which gives us a little bit of margin to put on any of the sides. So that just kind of stretches the image out. We can draw it as a border, which for an image is a little bit weird, but this is how we kind of like render a border. So these numbers now represent how thick the border is on any given side. If you just want it all to be the same side, you can just not do the individual values. You can just put one value in here, like 0.3 for instance. and everything will be set to 0.3, which is clearly a bit too much. So let's do 0.1, maybe even like 0.05, and that will now be a border. Then we have, of course, got the image, which is just normally rendering it as an image. And we also have a rounded box, which is effectively just an image with outline and rounding settings as well. I'm not going to go over every single appearance option and every single widget. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory. Like if we put in a text, it's going to have a thing for its fonts, which include fonts specifically might be something that we take a look at in the video where I want to talk a little bit more about text because they are a little counterintuitive. But that also includes like its font size, right? The letter spacing, the skew amount for letters, all that kind of stuff. Most of this should be fairly self-explanatory, I imagine. So now that we have this, let's just put this at the bottom right, and then this will be aligned to the center. So we'll put it right there somewhere, right here maybe. And then this will be aligned to the top right, but we're going to put it in the top left, or the other way around. It's going to be aligned to the top left. We're going to put it in the top right. So now we have a widget that's going to be a bit of a mess. And that is on purpose, because I want to show you what this anchoring actually does. And for that, we need to add it to the screen. So let's do that. I'll go into my third-person blueprint here. And I'll add a begin play. My blueprint has been kind of messed up lately, so I need to... And I will add a begin play event, in which we can create a widget. And this is just like spawning in an actor or constructing any other type of object, but it's specifically made for creating widgets. So it only shows you widgets to be created. So we'll create a WBP HUD. You can give it an owning player in case that is relevant for what you want to do. This refers to a player controller, not a player character. So if I just want to like get a reference to self for this, right? That isn't possible. We need to get player controller instead. And then the return value will be the instantiated widget object, which automatically is actually going to return a object of the exact type that you're making your widget of anyway. So that's kind of nice. You don't need to like manually cast it or anything. And when we have that, we can just add it to the viewport. So add to viewport. In newer versions of Unreal, we also have this add to player screen, which is really nice because now you can add widgets to specific screens if you're doing like a split screen game. I haven't personally explored that too much, but that is a thing that you can do apparently. Usually we just add to viewports. If you don't do this, the widget will be created, but it just won't be visible. And there's an important thing with widgets, and that is that we don't manually like destroy them or anything. Widgets rely on Unreal's built-in garbage collection system, which means that they only get destroyed when there is no more references to them existing anywhere. So as long as I like promote this to a variable as well, right? So we can like promote to variable. I can then remove this from the viewport and the object will still exist and I can add it back in at a later date. If I don't set this to being a reference variable, first and foremost, I won't have the capability of removing this from the screen at all, aside from maybe doing it from the widget itself. But then when it does get removed from the screen, it no longer has any references anywhere, so the object will actually get destroyed because Unreal doesn't hang on to objects that you are no longer able to use anyway. Which usually is a good thing because it takes a whole lot of like memory management headache out of your hands. It can also be a little bit annoying because if you want to destroy a widget, the only way to actually destroy it is to make sure that no other actors or objects have any references to it left over. Which in some cases can be a little bit of a headache. So let's give this a good name, HUD widgets. Anyway, with that, we will be able to see that if I now play the game, it adds my image, but you don't see the other two things, and that's because they are not properly aligned. If I tab out of this and I make this wider, you will see that it starts showing up with the text block and that image. And the issue is that these two things are aligned to this corner, which makes them really confused as to where they need to exist on screen. You can see that whatever I do, this thing kind of more or less stays in the proper position because it's aligned to the center of the screen, meaning that when the screen grows to the right, the image goes a little bit to the right, and to the left, it goes to the left. when the screen gets really thin, it starts going up a little because it tries to maintain its relative position to its anchor. But of course, this thing thinks it's anchored all the way to this corner over here, and so does this. So if we now go back in for our HUD widget, and we actually set these anchors to being in places that make sense. Anchors have a couple of presets, by the way, where they can be aligned to any of these corners or the center. We'll get into making these type of anchors as well, because these are more than just points, right? You can do wacky stuff with them. For the most part, right now we're just going to do these as points. I'll show you a little bit what the difference is in a moment. Now that we've done that, you see everything does end up being properly on screen. And if I use F8 to tab out of the game again, everything stays more or less properly on screen because it has the proper context of what it should be aligned to. So setting up your anchors properly is quite important. Now, anchors also, as you just saw, have this capability of having like these 4 corner pins. And generally speaking, what you actually want to do is not just align things to a point. Or most of the time that is good enough, and sometimes it is preferable. But oftentimes what you'll actually want to do is you want to align these corners to the actual corners of your widgets. This is just kind of a more in-depth version of anchoring, because now the anchor is actually aware of where the corners of your image exist and can scale things a little bit better accordingly. So for this one, I could just anchor it out to this, but I could also say, well, actually the image only exists up to here, right? So let's put the anchors in a way that it just covers the image, not the entire widget. And for the text block, I can say, well, I can just make it as big as the text block, or just as big as the text, or maybe a little bit bigger than the text. You really get into very situational stuff on what you want in any given case, but for the most part, just aligning these corners to the corners of your widgets will give you the best results. And now you can see that it does things even a little bit better, at least for these two. You will notice that this one does start getting squashed down a little bit. So again, sometimes maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe sometimes it's not preferable to use corners because it starts like squashing down images like this. So for this, and this one technically too actually, because you can see that it does become thinner as we go along, these are images, so we don't want those to like squash and stretch. But the text, for instance, we do want to maybe scale with the actual side of the screen. You can see that as the screen becomes smaller, the text will also become smaller and then bigger again. So for the text, that might make sense. For these, that might not make sense. So for these, maybe what we want to do is we want to just align these to like the center position of where it exists on the screen. Same thing with this. Aligning it to a corner or aligning it to the center. For this one, I think aligning it to the corner of this specific image makes a lot of sense. And you'll see that it stops being squashed and stretched now, because it doesn't have that height and width information, so it's not going to squash and stretch it as a result. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for what to do with these anchors, and they often end up being a confusing thing people get hung up on. For the most part, the very most important thing is that you do give them an anchor position. And if you want to play around a little bit with giving them those like little corner positions as well, you can do that. If that does end up messing with your scaling, if you scale up and down your viewport size, you just go back to either setting up different corners or just singular points. So now as a last quick thing, what I said about these sub-widgets is that we can set these up to have some code of their own, and then we can either make children of them or instances of them and set their values to something different. I'm going to do something super quick with this image over here. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make this into a couple of different images. That's the reason that I use an overlay here, because if I just wanted this to be one image, I could just set it to being an image. But an overlay is a space that allows multiple different sub-widgets. Not every type of widget allows any sub-widgets or even multiple sub-widgets. If I try to make this image a child of this image, it can't do that because images don't support having child widgets. We'll get around to setting up stuff about that in a later video, but for now I'll just make 4 images. I'm going to align these to the corresponding 4 corners. And what we're going to do is make this fill screen real quick so that I can see which corners I have already done and which ones I have not. I am missing one of them, which is here. No. Okay, now we've got these in all 4 corners. For the draw size of these images, I can actually set them to draw as bigger images as well. So I'm going to set this to draw as images that are 100 by 100. You can very much just select multiple of these at the same time and just update their values. So now I've got 4 images that will display as 100 by 100 units. So if I go back into the HUD, you can see that that is very much what this does now. Every single widget comes with its own event graph as well, which you might have seen already. So we can set up these images, all of them, to work off of variables. And here we have 3 different events. Event pre-construct, event construct, and event tick. In a lot of cases, pre-construct and construct will do the same thing for things that are dynamically added, like during runtime. So event construct usually is good enough. The big difference is pre-construct also works in design time, meaning that it will actually run the code whenever you put it as a sub-widget into another widget. So I'll show you that. We can set this brush from a texture, and I will just copy that node over a couple of times and hook up the other 3 images to that as well. Texture, and that one, and then that one. And then I will promote all of these to variables. So there'll be texture, texture 0, texture 1, and texture 2. And then if I set these to be instance editable, like exposing them, going back into my HUD, I suddenly have these 4 textures to fill in. So I can set this to a texture, and you can see that it fills it in. It is a little bit weird with the normal map, so maybe use something that's not in normal map. So now that's this one thing. And you can see it does it in the designer. But if this were in the normal event construct instead, you would see that it doesn't actually do it in the designer here. But if I actually run the game, you will see that it still does do it. Because event construct only runs in the actual game. Event pre-construct also runs in your widget editor. That's why it has this in design time value. Because if you want to do something that only shows in previews, you can just add in like a branch here for design time and then do one thing if you're in design time. But if this is false, you do something else because that means that you're just like on runtime, right? So that's the way that you can set up these like sub-widgets that can get instanced over and over and over again in a bunch of different places. Now, there's a couple of other events that you can also take a look at. Like on destruct, which is just when it gets destroyed. Again, this is a little bit weird because it gets automatically destroyed by Unreal's garbage collection when there's no longer any references that happen to it. But that doesn't necessarily happen immediately because Unreal's garbage collection works on just like every now and then it runs, right? It doesn't run every frame or anything. And then we have a bunch of other things that aren't necessarily super important to do right now. Aside from one that I can't see in here right now, which is called onInitialized. There's an important distinction between onConstruct and onInitialized because onConstruct runs every time you add this thing to the viewport. OnInitialized, however, only runs when it is initially created. So if we go back into here, when we run this, it will run onInitialized. When we do this, it will run onConstruct. So if you want to run code before adding something to the viewport, you run it on initialization, not on construct. For all practical purposes, that does seem very similar, and in most cases it will be. But sometimes you want to pre-create a widget and run some code on it, and then be able to just add it to the screen at a later date. At which point the information that you might want to pass into it might have already like disappeared, or it might be different or whatever. On initialized, there's a reason that it doesn't give you one of these ghost nodes by default. It's not super often that you can, but it is good to know about it. That is a basic overview of the most important things about creating widgets in Unreal Engine. This is a bit of a mess of a video compared to the other videos in this series because I just want to show everything that is most important to understand. So as a recap, we have canvas panels, which are expensive to render, so you don't want to use them all too much. Only use those for widgets that you physically actually add to the screen for your player. then any sub-widgets that we want to make those for the time being, we're just going to call those overlay widgets. Those are widgets that we make with something other than a canvas panel. In this example, we're using overlay. We're going to be using overlays a lot, but there's other options to use here. Overlays might initially seem more restrictive because you can't easily put images in places that you want to put them, unlike the more freedom that we have in a canvas panel. That's something that you're going to get used to. It's not going to be that big a deal once you're actually used to it, and these do perform a lot better and also more predictably. And on the canvas panels, do make sure to anchor things to positions on the screen that makes some semblance of sense. Well, next time we're going to start diving into this whole palette on the left hand side here that we have. There's so much stuff to take a look into, and all of these have their own little like neat tricks and things that you need to know about them. Some of these I will combine into videos, like when I talk about text, we're going to be talking about text and rich text in one video. But by the end of this series, I'm going to have talked about most of the things in this menu. So there's going to be a lot of it. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. And a huge thank you to my Cave Big Brain tier supporters, which care more for coding than impulse control, Earl Monserville Urno, my Cave Students tier supporters, Oiku, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias.